Welcome to a special edition of Still Processing, a 76ers podcast. I'm your host, Zach Chevalola, here as always with my guys, Sam D. Giovanni, Justin Crosby. Guys, what a crazy way to start this week's pod. So we're obviously 10 minutes late. A little bit of that's our own lagging behind, but part of that is the latest news that just dropped on Paul George, which is now suddenly going to be our initial talking point. So Mark Stein releasing and again, this is still speculative, but this is building steam. He's not the only person to kind of feel it's going this way. But on Paul George, apparently it's becoming increasingly likely that he is going to opt in and pick up his $48.8 million player option for next season, trying to force the Clippers to trade him elsewhere. So goodbye, almost guaranteed to the concept of Philadelphia being able to sign him into open cap space. How do we feel about the idea of acquiring Paul George now that it seems like it may have to be done through a trade as opposed to through free agency?
I mean, the one of the big uh, points of intrigue with Paul George is the fact that he would be a signing and not someone that you have to give up assets for. I remember going back a few episodes, we talked about some of the options, and they were, him and Jimmy Butler were two of them. And for whatever, upgrade people thought or still think that Jimmy could be, like part of the appeal with Paul George is that, you would have to use the cap space for Paul George, but for Jimmy, you would have to use the cap space and other picks to trade for him. And so that's kind of what made it better. You get a guy like Paul George, then you use the picks to build up the rest of the roster. And I think that, now that he's doing this opt in thing and the contract isn't as long as it would have been had he just signed in free agency, is obviously you have to give up more, but I don't think it, he's not going to be at like his peak value, especially given all the downsides to him, like his age, his recent comments about how things changed so drastically with the Clippers and how he, wasn't super big on like playing defense or doing the little things or anything like that. So for me, it doesn't change anything of him being a pretty solid but not fantastic option for the Sixers. But this definitely changes the calculus a little bit. And even if they have to give up one of their first round picks, it's a much different scenario where they can't be as deep as, or they won't have as many assets as they could have because they had to give some up for Paul George. So I still think amongst the options that fall under like the third star, I think Paul George is still a little higher up there for me. But obviously, this is it would be a different way to different negotiations now, where you're negotiating with the Clippers as opposed to just finding out a contract for George. So it does change a little bit, but not a whole lot for me.
Yeah, I'm in the world of yeah, again, everything that Sam said. I would actually it would just make better sense for the Sixers and how they want to maneuver and build around the team if they were just able to sign Paul George in the cap space. But now that he, like you said, may possibly have to give up assets, maybe a first round pick, or they may ask for two, who knows? It could just get interesting for the Sixers and their assets and how they try to build around the team going forward. And, Zach, I know we talked about the off air, so I'll leave that to you. But even like something of like a Tobias, sign and trade to the Clippers if they were truly interested, that might be interesting for both parties, but who knows, what the ramifications are of something like that. So
I can tell you.
I
If you
know.
want to know the ramifications, I can
Yes.
tell you. So I think actually Keith Pompey was the first to float out that idea of a potential sign and trade. And I don't think it was him saying it as something he would recommend. I think it was more so just kind of talking about physical possibilities. So yes, that potential is there. The opportunity for a sign and trade, sending Tobias to LA for Paul George in that case. So the issue with a potential sign and trade is the salary cap ramifications from there. So I don't know that either team would really be interested in it, mostly just because of the penalties that kind of come along with that. I don't think either team is interested in being hard capped at the first apron. Uh, large part because when you talk about, Philadelphia, obviously they want flexibility when it comes to figuring out what they're doing in this star hunting pursuit, trying to add players around. I expect Philadelphia to be very active around the trade deadline, just like they're active this offseason. And the issue with the Clippers, so they won't be above the apron now, but if they were to acquire Tobias Harris, through the sign and trade with Paul George, and they're hard capped at the first apron, that really affects their ability to bring back James Harden, which is going to potentially be another issue at that point. And the dominoes effect, from that, who really knows? But it'd be interesting. I think it'd be controversial. I think it'd be electric in a sense. But it's for me personally, I am of the mindset that, kind of how Sam said, getting Paul George was so attractive because you did not have to give up any assets for it. I mean, if you're talking about a sign and trade straight up for Tobias Harris, that's one thing. I don't know that would really work for any of the parties involved. But if that were the reality of what would happen, it's a little bit more palatable. But for me, if we're talking about giving up draft picks, I think Keith also mentioned the idea of 16 going to LA. I have zero interest in that, and that's mostly just due to the fact that Paul George himself was not the perfect candidate, the perfect target. I think that he was kind of the best of an imperfect situation. There's guys like Brandon Ingram out there who I think is interesting, but he's going to be expensive in terms of assets you have to trade for. Talking about guys like Donovan Mitchell, who's seeming less and less likely day by day. Jimmy Butler has many question marks alongside him as well. So when you look at, and then LeBron James just isn't happening. So just to acknowledge that real quick. But, when you kind of look at the situation, Paul George seemed like the best available option because you were not going to have to give up those assets, and he would then be movable thereafter. Clearly, there are teams that are still interested in Paul George. According to this time, the Warriors are checking in. I think he said the Rockets are checking in as well. The New York Knicks are interested. There are teams interested in Paul George, which makes this more difficult for Philadelphia to acquire him if he does opt into that player option, because now there's going to be effectively a bargaining war. And I don't think Tobias Harris is going to be the winning hand in that case. When you talk about some of these other teams that are trying to land him. I mean, the Knicks can easily convince the Clippers that Julius Randle is a good, winning player. And that's your starting chip for New York there. So like that, I think already, even considering Julius Randle's faults, is already vastly superior than a Tobias Harris option. So I just don't know that it's realistic for Philadelphia. I don't think that's a war that they would win. I don't think it's a war they should be trying to win at the same time either. So, for me, it's not the play that I would go. I would turn my attention to guys like Brandon Ingram, guys like DeJounte Murray, kind of younger stars who, yes, it's going to take some assets to get them. Maybe you don't empty your chest, and then you're able to flip them potentially down the line should you have to. But everyone watching along, give us your take on Paul George. Are you willing to trade for him if it's not just signing him? Again, he's 34 years old, and the other aspect of this is that Paul George is going to want to get paid after this. So initially, people were having issue with the fact of giving a guy who's 34 years old a 4-year deal. The Clippers obviously had a problem with that. Fans in Philadelphia had a problem with that. Now, effectively, you're talking about 5 total years because you're paying him 4 years after this year. So everyone in the chat, let us know how you feel about that, how you feel about the idea of adding Paul George in the sense of having to pay assets to get him, and then talking about paying him for 5 years. Let us know your thoughts about that, or who else you'd like to target instead. But really, the point of today's pod was to kind of talk about some of these draft prospects because we are 2 days away from the draft. There is, I think, still some excitement around that, even though the league-wide expectation seems to be Philadelphia moving this pick. Maybe not for Paul George necessarily, but potentially moving this pick for some other player who can help, or trading down to acquire more assets, whatever the case may be. But what we're going to talk about today, we're going to put Paul George aside for now. I feel like we kind of fleshed that out. I'm getting a little heated about it. I don't know about you guys, but we're going to take a look at some of these exciting draft prospects that are coming up. And the first guy, I think that there is some excitement around this potential prospect. I want to get your guys' opinion on him. The guy that I want to talk about is Colorado Buffaloes forward Tristan Da Silva. So either of you guys have a strong opinion on Da Silva one way or another?
That guy to me is, I think, one of the best guys the Sixers could get of guys who are likely to be available. Obviously, we won't know for certain until the draft rolls around, but of guys who seem to be available in that just after the lottery range, I think he is. I think he would be a fantastic addition for any team looking to win now. Obviously, the Sixers are one of those teams. He's obviously much on the older side as far as prospects go, but he just does so many good things. He does a really good job of making winning plays on the margins, and I think guys like that translate very well to high level basketball and fit alongside a lot of different types of players. Da Silva is pretty big. He can defend a lot of positions. He can make plays on and off the ball. On offense, he's not someone that you would expect to be, a creator in the sense of that, the three stars that we were just talking about. Da Silva is much more of a role player type of guy who will take the shots that come to him and rely on the creation abilities of Embiid, Maxey, whoever else the Sixers get. But I think he's a really high IQ player in that he shoots good shots. He shoots a good amount of threes, and for someone who's listed at, I believe, 6'9", like he's a really nice floor spacer at the forward spot. Spent a lot of time in college to develop his game. He seems to be like a pretty intelligent passer. Again, not a guy who's going to be creating his own shots, but when Joel gets doubled, when Tyrese forces the defense to swing over because he's beating his man, then you get it to Da Silva, and he's either shooting the ball as a spot-up shooter or he's keeping the ball moving. Guys like that, and especially at the forward spots, I think are super valuable. As much as you want guys who can take advantage of shooting the shots that Embiid and Maxey can create for them, you also want guys who can help create for the two stars too, make it easier for them. And Da Silva sticks out to me as a guy who, again, especially guys who should be available where the Sixers are picking at 16 overall, should be available. Obviously there's a lot of talk about trading the pick for a ready-made guy, but to me, a prospect like Da Silva makes it so much more meaningful and much more beneficial to just hold on to that pick and take a guy like that. Obviously prospects are seen as a roll of the dice, but not every roll of the dice is as risky as others. And there are plenty of veterans who could do what Da Silva does, but Da Silva has even a little bit more room to grow. He'll be under contract for a while because of just how rookie contracts work. I think that if he's available at 16 and the Sixers are looking to play it safe, they want to make sure they get a guy who plays a position they need, a guy who does stuff on the floor that they will need out of their role players. I think he would be a fantastic decision.
Yeah, at 23, he kind of better be ready to play. Like it is a benefit for him to have that time to kind of marinate in college and really kind of refine his game a little bit. But that's the kind of catch-22 of it, is that if he's not ready to go from the jump, which I think that he would be, but if he's not, then you're left kind of with a really big question mark at that advanced age, that he is coming out. I do really like Da Silva. One thing that I've been kind of, when I think about player comparisons, because that's half the fun when you're looking at the draft, is like, well, who does he kind of resemble in this area, that area, this other area? For me, I'm starting to see more and more of, George Niang, but better in certain areas, right? So I think that he is a bit more versatile as a defender. Even I don't think he'll be a great defender at the next level, but he's ahead of where George Niang was, certainly. I think that he is quicker. Obviously, I think that he. Sorry, I just got some news there. I think that there's going to be an opportunity for him to kind of, fill that role in Philadelphia, as it were, and work a lot of similar actions that Niang did, be a spot up option. Somebody who I think can add some fire to your team as well, kind of like Niang did. So I say this as a compliment, for anyone who's thinking that this is, a potential slight at Da Silva. I think that he can be kind of a George Niang plus for Philadelphia, and that's the kind of role that, maybe at 16 that kind of feels like something that you don't really want. Again, the draft is kind of weak in the top, but there's a lot of role players throughout the middle. So, even if Philadelphia does end up trading down and say De Silva's still available, I'd say that's probably the ideal situation for Philadelphia going after him. But I do think he would fit like a glove, and especially being able to learn under a guy like Nick Batum, I think that would be huge for De Silva moving forward. I think that there's a bit of room, to improve in terms of him as, he'll never be a facilitator, but just as a ball handler, there's effectively nothing. But as a passer, just moving the ball around, I think that there are solid tools that can be expanded upon further. So Nick Batum, I think, would be an interesting mentor sort for him, assuming Philadelphia does bring him back. But Justin, do we have any strong feelings on Tristan Da Silva one way or the other?
Definitely, like him. I think, everybody talked about how he fits. I think that's the most important part, that he's older. He's been playing longer. I feel like his size helps. I feel like the fact that he's a catch and shoot guy, willing shooter. Everybody talked about his passing. I do think that's one thing that this team lacks a little bit of, and it's not like they will count on him to do it all the time, but his weak side, like playmaking, I think would help make a difference. So, like you said, after the shot clock running low or whatever the case may be, and he's got the ball, and on a swing, he pumps and drives on the closeout. He can make a play after that. Whether it's passing to another open man, dropping it off to Embiid, for a dunk or a layup, whoever, Paul Reed. So I think it'll be, I think he'll be a good fit.
I have another player comp to add for Tristan Da Silva. As a guy who is big and can defend pretty well, shoots the three pretty frequently, and has kind of the capability to put the ball on the deck a little bit, but isn't someone that you look for as a go-to option. One guy that comes to mind is Maxi Kleber of the Mavs. He's a guy who I've
I love that.
kind of enjoyed for a while. Like, I think he's not an extreme like standout role player, but I think he's pretty underrated and a very key part of the Mavs' success recently. Obviously, he was hurt for the playoffs a little bit, but he's such a solid player. He seems to know the game really well. He moves his feet pretty well on defense, better than you would expect from somebody of his size. Shoots the ball more frequently than Da Silva does, and I think that Da Silva will probably get his 3-point frequency to the level of Kleber, which his last year in college, Da Silva's 3-point attempt rate was 40%, which means 40% of his shots were threes. For Kleber, it's more so 60, but I think that Da Silva being one of the main guys at Colorado, along with KJ Simpson, I think, and Cody Williams, like, he had to do a little bit more with the ball in his hands. I don't expect that to be his role, particularly in the league. So he could have, be more of a main spot up guy like Kleber is. And he's a guy that also is pretty smart with the ball in his hands, can, attack a closeout and get into the mid range, get a little floater off, or can keep the ball moving really well. So a guy like that, and especially again with good size on defense, even if the defensive chops are unproven, to have a guy at that size, legitimate, power forward size, power forward next to Embiid, I think would be huge. So that's one of the comps I usually go to for Da Silva, and at least just me specifically because I'm a fan of Kleber's game, that leads me to have more faith in Da Silva as well.
Yeah, no, I think that makes perfect sense, and I agree that he's been one of the more unsung players in Dallas for a number of years, but they clearly love him there. One other player who I think this probably maybe alongside Jared McCain, who's been mocked to the Sixers more than any other player, has been Jacoby Walter out of Baylor. Justin, how do you feel about Jacoby Walter? Is that a guy who you think could be kind of a role player in the future going forward for Philadelphia, or what's your stance on Walter?
I mean, I think he fits the profile and what they would be looking for, right? A shooter, a guy who can catch and shoot with a good, nice, smooth, quick release, as well as, movement shooter as well, right? So off a pump fake, pull-ups, he has pretty good arsenal when it comes to shooting. One thing is that he wasn't necessarily that efficient in college. I think he shot like 33% or 34% from beyond the arc in college. So, I mean, that's probably around league average in the NBA. Maybe like 36, 37 is league average. But I just think that in a more spread out floor in the NBA that he would get, I think those opportunities he would get more like the most clean looks he probably ever got in his life. So I think that that can definitely help, and it fits the profile what they're looking for. He's like 6'5", I guess, 6'6". So he's classified as a wing, but more like a big two guard. So even if he could fit on the floor next to Maxi if he was playing the two at some point. So I do think if he fits in that aspect. Um, he's okay on defense. I mean, I think he's a guard that could stand to get better on defense. I know he competes, but I think he can definitely stand to use some more um training and stuff on defense. But I think he's the profile of what they're looking for. But I don't necessarily know if he has super high upside. Um, and I mean upside, we're not talking about star, right? But I mean like high utility role player. Like I think of like Trevor Ariza. Like you know what I mean? Like a 3-point chucker who's going to be able to play both sides of the ball. Will he be able to be that? I don't know.
Yeah, the comparison for him consistently has been Contavious Caldwell Pope, who the Sixers have been linked to a lot during this offseason. So you think if you just take that in a vacuum, that Philadelphia would be interested. But there's certainly several things that you pointed out that I think are actual concerns with Walter. So he kind of gets the label of a 3-and-D prospect, and I think the bones are there for him to be that. I think that it's kind of unrealized potential, and his general lack of athleticism is going to kind of be a bit of an issue for him to reach that potential. At the same time, the fact that he's not an overly strong ball handler kind of limits his potential to grow out of that role as well. So I would say that I'm not disinterested in Walter. I don't love it at 16. Again, I think maybe another guy that you can trade down from, but one point that you brought up that I think there's a lot of truth to is just the idea that in an NBA setting, especially in Philadelphia, there's going to be a lot more open court for him to work with, which would lead to better opportunity from three, right? So this is not a knock on Yves Missi. I'm a big Yves Missi fan, even. But if we're talking about having a big man down low who has the offensive presence of Joel Embiid versus Yves Missi, we're talking about two completely different stratospheres, right, of that offensive ability. So to have that kind of distraction down low opens up so much. To have Tyrese Maxey all over the court opens up so much. And be able to run in transition with a guy like Maxey, I think would work well to Walter's game as well. I think there are things to like, but there's kind of enough, whether it is banking on potential or what he lacks in terms of ball handling and athleticism, that has me to the point where trade down candidate, but probably not at 16. But Sam, are you more bullish on Walter than either of us are, or are you about the same camp?
I think I'm closer to you. To me, the Sixers drafting Walter would be a bet on the archetype that he could be. The inefficiency at Baylor is obviously worth taking note in, but the fact that he shot decently from the free throw line, did shoot a lot of threes, was very high volume shooter, kind of lends to the idea that at least that skill will translate to the NBA level. But I'm not as confident as in his other skills, and that to me is why I think this would be kind of a swing for the fences, at least relatively for what you can get at 16 for the Sixers if they go this way. The comparison to KCP is, I understand why it's there. Personally, I think it's a little bit rich um, for Walter, and he's pretty young. Maybe he can prove that down the line, but I'm not super confident that he will be able to get there. And yeah, he can shoot it, but if he's not really able to create for himself, even at the next level, even with the help of Embiid and Maxi, obviously it will be helpful to have them taking the attention of the defense. But there's a lot of if you're drafting a guard, a wing, you want them to be able to do a little bit with the ball in their hands more than just attack closeouts and whatnot. So it's also kind of it's not great that someone who was such a high profile shooter doesn't his playmaking is still such a big work in progress. He was more turnover prone than he was, getting assists. So that's obviously a bit of a red flag. And so I think if you wanted to look for another player comparison that's maybe not as flattering as KCP, you could look at another Maverick. Ironically enough, I'm naming Mavericks in Tim Hardaway Jr. And that guy's going to shoot the ball. He's going to be able to play off the gravity of a star. But what else can he do? And Tim Hardaway is a fine player. Like obviously there are plenty of teams be like, oh yeah, sure, we could have a guy like that on the bench, but to make that guy the pick at 16, and I guess especially considering who else they could get, I understand the appeal with him, but he's someone that I think I'm lower on than the consensus. And if the Sixers do pick him, I think I'd be pretty surprised.
Yeah, he in a sense is almost like the anti-De Silva in terms of not really ready to compete. You're really kind of banking more on projection than immediate impact. So with a guy like Jacoby Walter, yeah, no, I do get it there. One guy who and I'll plant the flag now, because Devin Carter will not be available at 16, and yes, he will not be available at 16. That's why we're not going to even talk about him on this show, okay? But outside of that, the guy at 16 for me has been relatively clear for a while now. And kind of the opposite to Jacoby Walter, he's been the other guy who's been mocked to Philadelphia quite a good bit. And for me, the guy that I think Philadelphia should target if they do keep 16 is Duke guard Jared McCain. Sam, and as you're about to take a drink, where do you stand on Jared McCain as a potential spark plug for Philadelphia moving forward?
The appeal with him is very easy to understand. I mean, he's got a case to be one of the best shooters in the class. He's up there with guys like Reed Shepard, Dalton Connect, as guys who they will have that skill at the very least translate to the NBA level, and it should be really, really good. He shot the ball super well in his season at Duke, shot it in a lot of different ways, is a very crafty scorer and someone who plays pretty hard too. So he doesn't project to be an incredible defender, but he's also not someone who's going to be taking plays off. He's a guy who could at least fit in a team setting and contribute that way. I would say that for the Sixers, I think if they do get him, it wouldn't be a bad pick whatsoever. But there are some concerns that I have to where I wouldn't necessarily view it as a home run, or at least not like an outstanding, like super, super great pick. I think in my eyes, it would just be a good pick, which, not knocking that. But I think for as crafty as he is, it's, kind of, we have to see how what he can do translates. He's not insanely quick. He doesn't, he's not super, super explosive. It's just a lot of, creativity and his jumper falling. And he's someone who his draft stock obviously is boosted by his amazing 3-point shooting. And there's not a lot of concern that shot won't translate. But if it doesn't, or if it's only like he's a pretty good shooter, then I think his value elsewhere is going to diminish a lot. He's the listing I saw of him was right, roughly 6'3" with roughly the same wingspan. And obviously, you don't have to be, like a super key looking into that. You can look at a guy like Tyler Hero, who had a lot of the same concerns, not a super long wingspan, not insane athleticism. He's obviously been at least a pretty solid option for the Heat and has been able to post, good scoring numbers. So for McCain, I also, because of McCain's limitations, I question how great of a fit he is with Maxey. I think there is, the understanding of, because the Sixers are so deep with their first rounder, you just want to get a guy can be pretty good. And I think McCain can be that type of guy, but I question building around two small guards, even though they're both dynamic on offense in their own ways, both can space the floor. I think the upside with McCain, he's someone that I'm going to have to do a lot of watching in summer league and be early in his career to see like how can he continue to grow his game. So I think he would be a pretty solid pick. If that's the pick the Sixers go for at 16, I definitely don't think it would be bad, but I think I have yet to buy his like ideal, top tier ceiling or like his highest possibility as the upside. I think it would be a pretty good pick though because of the skills that he does have.
Yeah, I mean, there's not anyone at 16, I think, that has the expectation to be an all-star in this draft. I mean, that's you look at Walter De Silva, that's not the case. You look at some of the other guys that we're going to talk about later. I don't think that's the case with them either. With McCain, the lack of athleticism, I agree, is absolutely an issue. I think it's part of the reason why he's down here. Uh, it's not the complete answer. I do wonder about him possibly trimming down a little bit and increasing that quickness. He's coming in a bit heavier than some of these other guards. He's around the same size height wise as Reed Shepard and Devin Carter. He's 10 pounds heavier than Devin Carter, 20 pounds heavier than Reed Shepard. So, some of that extra bulk has kind of helped him defensively, where he's not an overly talented prospect, but he is a guy who's very engaged on the defensive end. So, maybe that extra weight and strength is worthwhile to keep with him. Maybe trimming down a little bit and being a bit quicker, off the jump. Because the one thing that I agree, as far as I'm concerned, limiting what he did in college versus at the next level, if he's not going to be able to be quick off some of those actions against NBA caliber defenses, that I think is truly what's going to nullify him. I don't really have any concerns as far as a catch and shoot shooter. I think relocation, his ability to shoot relocation threes should hang as well. But working off those similar, Seth Curry, JJ Redick, Tyrese Maxey actions, he's shown an ability to do that at Duke. I do question if the difference in quickness and athleticism is going to be able to allow him to do that at the NBA level. But that being said, I wouldn't necessarily expect him to be built around, the team built around him and Tyrese Maxey. And I don't think that's really the expectation for any of these guys. I mean, are you expecting to build around Tristan Da Silva? Like, that's the kind of thing is what we're looking for, I think, is, and maybe my expectations in this draft are just overly low. And, maybe that's just me being a bit negative, but, I think that we're more so looking for long-term role players as opposed to, I'm not even overly hopeful about a long-term starter. And again, maybe that's just me being pessimistic, but that's the expectation that I have. And I think McCain can kind of serve that role well. I do agree that, like, defensively, you're asking for a lot if you're starting with that backcourt. But the offensive, ability of a guy like Jerry McCain, I mean, I think that we're talking about something exciting, just based on the assortment of shots that he's able to make and take. Duke ran a very Filipowski centric offense, right? Which I think is good and bad. So it was bad because it didn't give him an opportunity, I should say, to really play make. And so that's a question for him coming out of the draft. How is he as a playmaker? That's a very real, legitimate question. At the same time, I think it does prepare you well for playing alongside Joel Embiid. So there's obvious question marks around him. For me, if you have a trait that you're clearly a master of, that's what I'm looking for in this draft. That's why I think Da Silva is valuable, because I think is an unquestioned strong shooter. I feel the same way about Jerry McCain. And then there's other guys that we're going to talk about later on who are kind of experts in their one or two niches. And I think that's why they'd be contenders at 16. But Justin, we haven't heard from you in a minute, man. How do you personally feel about Jared McCain as a prospect for Philadelphia?
I mean, I like him. I know the fit with Maxey overall be questionable, two small guards. I do think that it works if you have the right team fielded around them. Embiid, of course, is a great rim protector. Then you got, some good defenders around them. Whether it's a new defender wing, or whether it's Kelly Oubre or Batum or whoever the case may be, to get some defense around him. I think that could help. Not to say that he would start with Maxey, but just in those lineups, I do think that his playmaking is a little bit of a question. But I think that, again, in a system where offense is kind of ran through Embiid, he does have the ability to run a pick and roll. I think that's where Embiid is at his best at this point now. So I think that would be something where I feel like, at the end of the day, he will be able to prove that he could do. The shooting is a plus plus. And I do think that, him being able to be a guard and have Maxi run off ball actions, I think is helpful too. Again, we're not thinking at 16 that he'll turn into a star, but a quality role player, I think, is something he could do. Um, you look at guys, I know Sam brought up Tyler Hero. I know people online have said, his comparisons like Seth Curry. Um, I look a little bit, and this is just me. I'm not an NBA scout, but I look a little bit. He looks a little bit to me like has a little Gary Trent Jr. in him as well, as far as how he shoots the ball, how he can move without the ball. So I think that's a valuable skill, and he can win you games like that. So I think it would be an interesting pick. I would be all on board with the pick, and I think I wouldn't say a slam dunk, but it would definitely, for me, it would be like a draft grade.
So I just got over saying how there's no guys who I think really have that high end potential, that kind of plus that starter, that all star potential at 16. There is one guy who I'm not overly bought in on, but I think without question has the highest potential, or the basically just the highest ceiling to potentially be one of those guys, to hit that true starter level. I mean, all stars asking a lot, but considering how scouts initially felt about this guy, I think the potential's still there. So the next guy that we're going to talk about, USC point guard Isaiah Collier. So Sam, I know you are well, I guess what I should say is I know that you've done your diligence on Collier. How do you feel about him potentially in Philadelphia?
I think first taking just stock of where Collier seems to be getting mocked to, I think he is crazily underrated by at least the people putting together a lot of mock drafts. The fact that I consistently see him in the 20s is nuts. I understand, USC didn't have the exact best season. Collier did deal with an injury during the season that kind of cut into his stock, but the season that he put together after being a 5-star recruit, and the fact that he isn't seen as like a potential like guy that could go pretty high in a draft with no clear top guys and no guys with perceived lack of like upside is really mind-boggling to me. He put together a very productive season at USC, and I posted this stat before on Twitter a few times, but obviously I'm gonna bring it into the pod. In the last 20 seasons, he is one of just 9 freshmen to put up 16 points, 4 assists, 1.5 steals with a free throw rate of 45, which means that he's getting to the line a lot. And obviously, there's a wide, even a decent range of guys who did and did not pan out, but that's a list that includes Ben Simmons, Kyrie Irving, De'Aaron Fox, John Wall, and Dennis Smith Jr., who all went pretty high in their respective drafts. Collier, to me, is a guy who puts fantastic pressure on the rim, not only to create for himself, but to create for others. And I think that ability to create for others could definitely shine more with NBA level spacing around him and having guys he can rely on to, kind of poke cracks in the defense first. I think his shooting is pretty solid. It's definitely not his strong suit. It's not one of his major selling points, but it's also not like he's a disastrously bad shooter. He wasn't horrible last year. He doesn't project to be like a total disaster. But even with that, it's something that he could work on. I think just what he brings as a creator, getting downhill, using his size to get into the paint, and then either spraying it back out to his shooters or scoring with creative moves, going, with fancy footwork, with fancy finishes around the rim. It seems to me like he just knows what his strengths are. And one of it is literally like his strength. Like he's a big dude, and he's someone that I think could be a pretty dangerous scorer and creator, and has at least the physical tools to be a good defender. We'll see if he's paired with someone who can create a lot of offense, if he can tap into that more. And I'm sure some of it was a product of just having the ball so much at USC. He couldn't do everything. But yeah, he's to me that he has a little bit of a risk at 16, but I think the upside is too great to ignore. It's a little bit concerning that a guy whose main skill is putting pressure on the defense, going downhill and scoring, that he's not an insanely explosive athlete, right? You look at the list of guys that I said. You look at John Wall, De'Aaron Fox, Dennis Smith Jr. Those guys were crazy, crazy explosive athletes. Kyrie Irving obviously has like the skill, the handles package, the shooting touch that very few people ever see. And Ben Simmons is obviously the size of a power forward. So those guys, they were able to translate that pretty easily. And Collier is obviously big, but he's not someone who is prone to getting up and finishing in traffic with a thunderous dunk, or jumping with the best of them, or just breezing by a guy. Like, he is athletic, but he doesn't have insane burst, I guess is the best way to put it. And so for someone who has questions as a shooter, whose value comes from what he can do with the ball in his hands, that is a little bit of, that's why it's a gamble. But I would just be really surprised if he doesn't find a way to be a contributor and isn't someone who can create offense for himself and for others at the next level. He's got the size to be next to Maxey, and I might have spoken a little too highly as using this pick for someone to build around, but the hope is that when you draft someone this high, they can stick around for a while and be at the very least a starter. And I think Collier has that ability to be a starter. His off-ball value is a work in progress, remains to be seen, but I'm a believer just in the talent that he has, and especially since he just finished up his freshman year, like, he's still pretty young. I think that if the Sixers, obviously, like we mentioned, De Silva is the safer guy, but if they want someone who they can believe, has a high ceiling and has a good chance of getting there, my money would be on Collier.
So with Collier, and you're absolutely right about 16. You're expecting, I think, a little bit more than just a role player in most drafts, at least. But with a guy like Collier, I am not overtly a fan. I'll be just upfront about that. The biggest reason being, I don't know how he fits with Philadelphia. If he can kind of turn himself into what Markelle Fultz has done in Orlando, but with a built jump shot a little bit. But if you're talking about a guy who's kind of working his way downhill as his primary offensive function, I don't really see where that availability comes from alongside Joel Embiid and Tyrese Maxey. What I will say is the Sixers need more guys who can do that. So that works in his camp as far as why Philadelphia should potentially be interested. The biggest thing I think for Philadelphia is why they might potentially go for Collier is that he may have the most value to then flip. I think that's something that cannot be overlooked, is the fact that if you can, and Nick Nurse is a strong developmental guy, especially with guards. If he can be developed a little bit, you're talking about a real flippable asset. But then again, at the same time, that projects well to him actually reaching that potential that he has, which I agree is very high. So if you're talking about a guy with 6'4" size who, he has to step it up defensively, he has to improve his range, but the ability to have a confident, versatile ball handler, yes, I think that is, if all goes right, the best value that you can get at 16. I'm not a big believer that it will all go right. However, I can think of a lot of draft picks that I'd be a lot less happy about than landing the guy who was projected to go potentially even number one at the beginning of this year. But Justin, how do you feel about Collier?
I'm in the middle of him. I think about, those, there's a couple comparisons out there for him, but I think the rim pressure, like you said, is super important. I think the jump shot is going to be the key for him. You talked about guard development. I think it's something, if he get drafted to the Sixers or wherever, right, he's going to have to really improve on that jump shot to really be able to make an impact, because we see that in those moments, whether you're a rookie or not a rookie, if you're playing minutes and it's the defense will flat out ignore you if they don't believe that you can shoot. And I think that that's something that he will definitely have to put in work. I do like his fit next to Maxi. He's a bigger guard, like husky guard, like strong, strength wise. So his ability to finish with contact will, I think, be big. I do think it's something that the Sixers need more of outside of Joel Embiid, his gracious ability to draw fouls, and hopefully Maxi will get a whistle next year. But I do think they, need somebody like that, and he can grow into that. When I think of Kyrie, they're not the same player, but I think of last year or the previous year, when the Sixers were picking and Jaden Hardy's name kept coming up. And I feel like it's that same type of not developmental guard, but guard where given a chance to work on his game, given opportunity, then he will be able to make some plays and help the team out. So I'm kind of looking at him like that type of guard. And I do think that Jaden Hardy will become a solid NBA player given time. So that's why I'm kind of looking at it. But I'm stuck in the middle. I wouldn't be upset if they picked him, or I think it would be a solid pick. But he does have a lot of upside. Zach said, going into this college year, a lot of people thought he was going to be the number one draft pick. And I think USC just pooped out so bad that, it just was a bad all around year. And, we'll see what his development shows. But he could have been number one. If they would have made the tournament or something, he still might have been top 10.
Yeah, I mean, and to Collier's or I guess you could even say in his defense, something that we've talked about this with Bronny James. And if we're going to say it for Bronny, we have to say it for him too. It was a total shit show at USC last year. So you kind of have to take, I think, everything with a little bit of a grain of salt. There's things like LSU missing the tournament. You know what year I'm talking about? That's one thing. That's not the same thing as USC missing the tournament last year. So I think that there is the potential for him to be better than effectively how he played. I know that's kind of a controversial topic. Like, well, if he was better, then he would have played better. But I think that there is that potential there. Collier is one of two consensus first round prospects the Sixers have worked out. At least that's been reported. They have kept things pretty close to the vest. They haven't worked out a lot of first round talent from what we're hearing. And when I say first round, I mean again consensus. So and I'm probably going to butcher the name, Pacome Diate. Like, I'm not talking about Pacome. I'm not talking about Trenton Flowers, who are guys whose tools and athleticism could launch them into the first round. But if we're talking about like real, like possibly at 16 first round prospects, Isaiah Collier has been one of only two that Philadelphia has worked out to the knowledge of the public. So I think that can't go, underappreciated in terms of who they may actually select with that pick. At the same time, I think it's a perfect opportunity to switch over to the other guy that they worked out. He's already been mentioned on the pod in a bit of a slanderous way, but like I said, I'm a fan of him. Yves Missi out of Baylor, worked out by the Sixers, potential backup center to Joel in a way that I feel like can be long-term. Justin, how do you feel about Missi? Are you a fan? Are you a fan of drafting a backup center and specifically him in that role? That's a long pause.
Yeah, I'm torn. Honestly, I don't like it at 16. I know there's a lot of discourse in Sixers land about having a good backup center, having value at the position because Joel Embiid, one, has missed games in his career. Two, they've seen to fall off a cliff when he's not on the court in the playoffs. But I feel like he has some capability, some defensive capabilities, some rebounding capabilities, but I just think that 16 is too high for them to even think about drafting a backup center. We're not talking about a wing here. We're talking about, a flat out center. And I don't think he's the type of player who can play with Embiid either, in my opinion. So, I don't see it at 16. And if I was there, I wouldn't even think about it. But
I don't think that he can play alongside Embiid. there's guys who I think potentially can. Deron Holmes comes to mind, and um, I mean, Kelly is probably not that guy who can play alongside Embiid too, but he's at least a better fit alongside than Missy. Uh, for me, the biggest thing here is that if they do draft Missy at 16, I do think that's a signal that the end of Paul Reed's era has come. And the reason why I think that's potentially a possibility is when you think about the tradable assets that Philadelphia is going to have this year. And I understand that Paul Reed has done a very good job. Let me, repeat that so it's not twisted. A very good job as Embiid's backup center. The team clearly does not overly value that position, which does bring to question why they would draft a backup center at 16. But at the same time, they have this belief that they can kind of get it from anywhere, right? So we've seen them reach into the bottom of the bargain bin to get backup centers before. You have a guy who is making nearly $8 million, and the Sixers didn't want to offer him that contract. He has that because Danny Ainge and the Utah Jazz offered it to him, and Philadelphia really had no choice but to match it. So, you have this guy who you can potentially utilize as a trade asset either during the draft or after it, even ahead of the deadline. So I think because of that and the ability to move him, we cannot write off that possibility, right? So for me now, focusing on Misi as a player, there's a lot that he does well that I think is the specific role of a backup center. He would be a great person to fill that role behind Joel Embiid. I just think that the defensive pressure that he's able to apply, his ability to block shots, really kind of work the post defensively in a way that Paul Reed can't, while maintaining lateral flexibility that some of the older guys that we've seen in Philadelphia before, or even just some of the bigger guys, a Tony Bradley, even a DeAndre Jordan, a Greg Monroe. None of these guys were able to move laterally the way that Nisi can. And he's not Paul Reed either, because there's levels to it, but I think that he just gives you a bit more of a well-rounded defensive game at the backup five position than Paul Reed, who is a very good paint defender, but just is not against certain centers. We've seen him exposed before, and that can happen to any player. But I just like Missy's defensive potential there. I agree 16 is probably too high for him. He would be the guy that I look at if Philadelphia trades down to say around 20 or so, between 20 to 25. I would say Missy's probably the guy. And Jacoby Walter, I think, fits into that range as well, should he fall. But I'm not really a fan at 16. I'm not ready to rule it out either. There's centers that I prefer, but I don't hate the idea of going with the 5 here. Sam, how do you feel about Yves Missi?
As a player, I think he is, going to have a really good shot at becoming a solid contributor at the NBA level. His ceiling is kind of limited at the moment because he just kind of seems like a typical rim running, lob threat, crash the glass, block shots type of center. And those guys often turned out to be pretty decent role players. So nothing particularly wrong with that. And to find that somewhere in the middle of the first round is pretty good value. I can see him fitting on a lot of teams picking in that range. But for the Sixers, I don't think they're one of the teams that makes sense. Zach, it's good that you brought up the fact that the Sixers technically didn't offer that contract to B-Ball Paul. It was the Jazz who offered it, and the Sixers matched. Daryl, anytime he's asked about, the backup center position, pretty much every time he goes on the Ricky Sanchez, like he's always talking about how much people put too much stock into it. So he didn't seem to be like over the moon about having the 16th pick in his end of the season availability. He obviously mentioned that good, but not a super great one. But still, for him to use this pick on a backup center, specifically one who doesn't fit with Joel, I just cannot see happening. I think that's a good thing because there are so much better uses of that pick for even all the guys who've been talking about, guys who have perceived higher upsides at more valuable positions, and guys who either could be ready made on the wing day one, or a guard that has a really intriguing skill that could give the Sixers a different element that makes them even better. I just cannot see him. I cannot see Morey and the Sixers drafting a big man at 16 unless it's someone like Kyle Filipowski, whose shooting makes him a potential fit next to Embiid. I would guess that if they do pick Nisi here, it's either someone really likes him and they're going to trade him for other stuff, or they're going to try to find uh, uh, Paul Reed to get a perimeter role player. So I shocked if they do end up picking a center here, and it's nothing against Misi or any of the other bigs. I think the vision that they might have of one of these bigger guys fitting with Embiid is it's possible, sure, but just not one that I could foresee happening. So I think, like you said, if Misi is picked, it probably spells the end for Paul Reed. And if it doesn't, I think that would be a very big swerve away from what Daryl has consistently done in team building and how he's talked. So
Yeah,
he's a good player, but I think they're a much better fit for him than the Sixers.
for sure. What's up, Sixers fan 229? He wants Devin Carter from Providence. I think we all do. Again, we said it at the top of this. I think if there's a player who, throughout this entire draft process, Sixers fans have consistently wanted, it's been Devin Carter. And we've watched him go from a prospect at the tail end of the first round all the way up to seemingly having a promise from the Bulls. It seems like it is the team that promised him, but at 11. So if there's a way for Devin Carter to fall somehow, some way, if there is, I guess, an opportunity to trade up, but I can't imagine Philadelphia trades up in this draft, then yeah, Devin Carter, I think for sure is a guy that would interest a lot of us. But yeah, no. So that kind of wraps up the first round, guys. Just real quick, I just want to, if we could all throw a name out of the second round that we like, is there any kind of second round crush? Because they do have the 41st pick. Justin, is there anyone in the second round that you've been particularly high on?
My bad. It took me a little bit to get up, mate. No, it took me a little bit. Second round, I think that's more. You can do a little bit more projects in the second round. I do like wing Ryan Dunn. He's like an athletic, like kind of do it all defender. I think that he's the type of guy, reminds me of a little bit of Matisse. He can guard one on one, although it's questionable whether Matisse can really guard one on one, but guard one on one, he can disrupt passing lanes. He can rebound for his size as well, and he can do like secondary rim protection. I do like that he can grow into somebody who can, if given a chance, he works on other parts of his game to see time on the court. He can really make a difference for a team as like a top primary defender. I do like that, but his limitations are, on offense are just, he's not a good shooter really. I think he shot like 20% from three. So is that something he can work on? Hopefully, he can finish at the rim, which is good. But outside of that, I think that the offense is really, really questionable. But at 41, he might be somebody who they give a two-way contract to. So it's just interesting to me. But he sticks out to me.
Yeah, I mean, if he falls that far, I think Philadelphia would be ecstatic. I mean, just his abilities as a defender, and I get not wanting to revisit history with Matisse, but if you're talking about 41, I think that's an acceptable range to kind of draft a guy who is really just a one-way player at that point. And I think that the level of engagement offensively with Dunn, he may not be talented overly offensively, but I just think that there's a bit more aggression than there was with Matisse. So I don't know, it's potentially interesting. I think he'll probably be a first round guy. But at 41, obviously I think it'd be ecstatic to have him there. Sam, how do you feel about anyone in the second round? Is there anyone who stood out to you for a second round?
I like Dunn a lot, and I would guess that he kind of goes earlier than when the Sixers are picking at 41st overall. His defense is arguably the best in the draft, but his lack of upside on offense is the reason why he could feasibly fall down to the Sixers. So if he does fall that far, I think that would be a fantastic pick. But I'll offer a different name: Jonathan Mogbo from San Francisco. Really, really versatile player, really athletic guy. Again, on the older side, but at the in the second round, you're really just hoping you find a guy who can stick. And I think Mogbo could be that guy. Like I said, he's pretty versatile. He's really athletic, really good at finishing at the rim. does a really good job of making plays, crashing the glass, uh, kind of creating havoc on defense. He's a guy who hasn't shown much upside as a shooter. He does shoot 69% from the free throw line, which isn't great, but at least for a big man, it's like, solid. But I think he's a guy who is skilled enough to where if he's used off the ball around Joel, I think he could be the type of guy who like would have really come in handy during the series with the Knicks. Mark Lang, one of our commenters, talks about we're underestimating the importance. Yeah, this comment right here, mentioning how it would be open season that the Knicks had, attacking the rim and also on the board. And like Magbo, again, it's risky. It's a second rounder. He's an older guy, so he might not be able to stick around. But I could see him being a guy who gives the Sixers that size at the 4 spot to fend off a team like the Knicks, more physical teams, bigger teams like the Timberwolves. I think he's definitely worth rolling the dice on. In the second round, there's plenty of guys where you could see, just one type of skill they had or some type of production that they have. And again, part of it is because he's older, but his college stats really do pop out: 14 points, 10 rebounds, 3.5 assists, 1.6 steals, 0.8 blocks. Like, he really just stuffed the stat sheet. And how much of that is translatable to the NBA is obviously questionable, but if he's the guy the Sixers pick at 41, I think that would be a pretty worthwhile swing.
Yeah, so he was a point guard for parts of high school before his growth spurt. Has insane ball handling for a guy his size. Like the fact that he played point guard going into high school, like that shows off in the way that he plays. He's been compared to Kenneth Faried a lot. He kind of has that relentless engine. I do agree that I do think he can play a bit alongside Embiid, especially since Embiid can stretch the floor. He's been a fast riser for a lot of reasons, and I don't think that he'll reach all the way to the first round. So I think 41 is, pretty potentially realistic. But he's definitely a guy that I do like for Philadelphia. We're pushing time, so I just want to throw one more name out there. Philadelphia has worked out a few different guys between the first and second round. Obviously we already talked about Collier, we talked about Nisi. I mentioned quickly that Bakome Dait. I knew I was gonna get it wrong. Bakome Dadiet worked out for Philadelphia as well. And then there's a few more names in addition to those. But one guy who I'm particularly high on, in addition to some of the more exciting athletes like a Trenton Flowers or what have you, but Cam Christie. If Cam Christie falls to 41, this is an opportunity to make right on where they went wrong with Isaiah Joe. The form is not as immaculate as Joe's was, but this is a guy who displays even a bit more athleticism than Joe. I think can grow to be a bit more of a total player than Isaiah, and it can be a knockdown shooter. So Cam Christie's a huge guy for me. And then there's going to be more and more guys, throughout that. There's so many guys in the second round I feel like you can talk about who would be fantastic prospects. And this is why I want them to keep this pick at the very least, because there's guys who can be contributing difference makers. Kevin McCullough from Kansas, I think, is a guy who can contribute. You get a guy like Justin Edwards who bank on that long-term potential, another guy who was supposed to be at the top of the draft. Dylan Jones, who they brought in for a workout. And then one guy who, they did bring in for a workout who I'm rather high on. I don't think that he's being looked at the 41 range, but maybe if they get a second round pick or trade down from 41. But Tristan Newton out of UConn, I think, is someone that more and more people should be talking about. He doesn't really have the jump shot. That's kind of his big knock. But to be able to bring in a guy who is so versatile, has size, hard-nosed defender, championship attitude, as well. I know you can't just chalk it up as simple as, oh, well, this guy won a couple national championships. He's going to do well in the NBA. But I do think that is a contributing factor for Newton in the sense that before he transferred to UConn, he kind of knew what it was like to be a big fish in a small pond. At UConn, after transferring there 2 years ago, he's now learned how to be a cog in a complete team system and play a role on a winning team. That's what he would serve in Philadelphia. So A few different names to like there, but thank you to everyone who watched and listened. We went a little long, but I appreciate you hanging out with us. Talking a little bit of the draft. We will absolutely be back next week to talk about the results of what happens draft day, which should be exciting. Will they keep the pick? Will they move the pick? What will Daryl Morey have to say after the fact? Well, we're going to talk to him and we're going to let you know what he says. So stay tuned next week, same time, 6:30-ish, and we'll be here to talk a little bit more Sixers basketball with you. But thank you again from myself, Zach Ciavolella, here with Sam DiGiovanni and Justin Crosby. This has been Still Processing, a 76ers podcast.